All right. So week two in CIT 82. This will probably be the last video I create before the start of the semester. I generally try to release 2 weeks of content. So that's probably what will happen here unless something else comes up. So here in week two, you get your first experience of a full week, a Monday night and a Thursday night. And each of them, that Monday night, again, 3 items, but those 3 items have 1 video, and then Thursday night, 1 video. So I don't really need to go over that content because that's been covered in those videos already. So sometimes in these videos, one of the things I try to clarify is common questions I get. But because it's before the start of the semester, I kind of have to remember, like, what are some of those common questions? And this is one of them that I get or that I find students struggle with a little bit because there's so many different systems that we use, right? So right now, you're watching this video in Canvas. Canvas, I've embedded, and these are terms that I'm hoping you're learning, a YouTube video in that Canvas shell, but it's still on YouTube, it's just embedded. And these are things you're doing actually in this class is you're placing things up on GitHub and you're embedding them into your post. So Canvas, GitHub, YouTube, right? So those I use YouTube for all the content for this class. So not only for other people's content, which I curate. Have you heard that word before? Where I curate, I go through and find what I hope is really good content. Which, by the way, if you ever are watching one of my videos and you've seen a better video, let me know because I like the having kind of a crowdsourced. I've had students in the past recommend videos that I've used, and those are great. All right, so that's those systems, and then right, you hear things like the cloud versus local. Like, this is something starting next week that you're going to hear, because next week, week three, we actually move from using GitHub in the cloud. Okay, we've been up to this point, and I want you to kind of get this week. That way, next week it starts to sink in a little more. This week and last week, you were using GitHub on a web interface, a browser, in the cloud. Next week, we're going to install Git, not GitHub, because the first part of Git Hub is Git, which is a version control, which is something on the roadmap, which you, I think, are learning this week. We'll look at the content, is an important skill for anybody in web development. So, that idea of the cloud, which I'm guessing all of you have heard, but it's so elusive. Like, what does that mean? It's just a cloud out there that you don't really maybe understand or see, but you use. So versus a local system, which you definitely feel and understand your local system, your PCs, right? A thing I will say going into next week too about this, and is that if you're using Windows or a Mac, you'll be fine for setting up your local, what we call dev environment. Using a Chromebook, and I know I've said this, so it is a little bit of a repeat, is doable, but requires you to have a bit more experience with command line. Command line, like what you're dealing with when you're dealing with the browser, what you're dealing with when you're dealing with like Microsoft Word, what you're dealing with when you learn something like called VS Code next week. Those are applications that are GUI, graphical user interfaces. And part of what you're going to learn starting next week is command line. Okay, which we're not going to do a deep dive. You're going to be introduced to it, and you're going to take what we've done on GitHub and you're going to clone it or basically copy it into your local system. So there'll be more technical steps next week. Okay. So those are important, right? So the other terms that I want to just clarify is Zoom versus Discord, right? So Zoom is where I hold my office hours, but as I said in the very first video, I'm also in my office at Fresno City. So you could come see me there. But if you are at home or somewhere else at a job and you can take some time and you have a question you want to ask, then you can jump on Zoom during my office hours and come in to see me. Okay. You don't have to tell me you're coming. Just, I mean, the only reason sometimes, and this is another reason to be on Discord, is that if something happens and my office hours have to move for a particular day, then I post that because students typically quickly see that. And on Fridays, I work at home. Actually, I have a virtual only office hour on Friday. So that's Zoom, right? And then Discord is really, and I'm reiterating here, but the idea of student to student communication, right? It's the idea that you have a question that you'll ask. And again, depending on the time of day, right? You may get other students in this class, whatever time of the day. And if I'm available and I can help you quickly answer it, I will as well. But resist the idea of pinging me on your post because students will think you're talking to me and they won't answer. And the other thing is, you can't direct message me in Discord. So, not only did I want to kind of reiterate those concepts, but just to say there's so many different systems that a class like this and probably our lives gets touched, right? Just think about all the apps you use in a day. I mean, I'm pretty amazed. I use a watch for tracking my workouts. Um, right? I have an actual device that tracks my sleep. I mean, we're not even getting into all the systems that I deal with around my job. And then around the community work, we run a small business. I mean, the amount of systems and software and websites is phenomenal. Okay, so in that reply that you're about to do, you could comment on any of that that you have. So let's just briefly, right? So here's week 2 content. You have a lecture, a hands on, right? And a current topics. And then Thursday night, lecture, hands on, current topics. You see the pattern, right, that exists. So, one thing I do want to say, just for clarity, is if for some reason, because I set up the course to reinforce or to make sure you work sequentially through the items. But if for some reason you do want to skip over an item, you can just hit a post. You can just hit a reply because that's all like the hands-on will look for. Like on the lecture, you could just post a URL and you could put a comment saying, I'm going to come back and do this later. So I don't want you to think like some students feel a little restricted, right? But there are things in this class that you will want to do in sequence, because if you try to jump into like a future week where we've covered some of the basics, then that could be a little more challenging. But something like a current topic, that makes more sense to me. And if you wanted to use that, I'm actually teaching you hacking right now, which, I mean, we could talk about that. That's actually, I teach in the cybersecurity program. And the difference between a hacker and a cybersecurity professional is kind of interesting because they have a culture that overlaps. Anyway, I won't get into that. So, do you have a question for me about any of the content? If not, right, my question for you, like, is are you what is your I know it's week 2, right? You've only been through 1 week. Is there something that you feel like that when in this discussion that I did today, there was something you missed? Or there's something you want to know more about? Like, tell me any of that, or answer or ask me a question as your reply this week. All right. Have a great week. I'll talk to you soon.